Hey there. Happy Wednesday. Recently I've been asked by a couple people kind of how I go about exposing my images. Do I rely on false color? Do I use waveform monitor? Do I just kind of look at it by eye? And the answer is honestly I do all of those things. Not always together, but I use a bunch of different tools to kind of expose my images. But if I had to give like a blanket answer as to how I expose my images, I tend to overexpose my images by 1.5 to 2 stops, and then in post bring them back down to a kind of more natural feeling place. Now, specifically today, I'm going to talk about the FX3 and kind of how I would go about doing it on this camera, because that is the camera that I own. That is the camera I shoot most of my projects on. So it just kind of makes sense for me to talk about this camera. But the properties that I talk about in this video today are kind of universal and can be used on pretty much any camera. So even though I'm specifically talking about the FX3, you can use this kind of method of exposure for pretty much any camera and it will work. So like I said, the way that I expose my footage is I like to overexpose by 1.5 to 2 stops. The reason that I do this is, well, there's a couple of reasons. The main reason is that it creates a really nice shadow roll off. In a lot of, all digital cameras, there is going to be noise. That's just kind of how it is. Some will have more, some will have less, but there will always be noise. And so if you want to kind of minimize that noise, and especially like minimize that like ugly, chunky red and nasty looking noise, then overexposing your footage is a really good way to kind of get rid of a lot of that, because when you overexpose it, then you have to bring everything down in post, and so you're kind of really burying that noise deep down in there, and you're not going to see it as much, and your shadow roll off is going to be really, really smooth. And so like on my video that I posted last week where I was doing that night scene, that's exactly what I did. Is I overexposed by 1.5 stops and then brought everything down, and so that way even in the darkest parts of the image you're not seeing any kind of chunkiness or like weird noise artifacts. Like you're not really seeing any of that, because I overexposed the footage and then brought it down in post. The other reason that I tend to overexpose my footage a little bit when I'm shooting is because a lot of the time when you're dealing with clients and whatnot, they will approve something on set and then you'll kind of get into the color grade and they'll be like, hey, can we actually brighten this up a ton? And then it's like, no. But you can if you do this, because now if we're brightening things up, we're not going to see any kind of change in our noise floor because we already shot it brighter. If we bring it down and then have to brighten something back up, that's okay. We can brighten it back up to 1.5, 2 stops, however high you exposed it, and most likely you won't add that much to the noise floor. Now I will say the one thing that you do have to keep in mind when using this technique is that when you're overexposing, you need to make sure that you're not clipping. If you're clipping, this technique is not going to work, because when you try to bring everything down, you're going to get weird banding and artifacts in those highlights because they are clipped and there's no information there to bring back. So be careful and make sure you're really riding that line very carefully of overexposed versus clipped, because clipped you can't bring back. Obviously this isn't a new technique of exposure. This is something I've done for many, many years, and honestly this is something that I kind of avoided doing up until about 6 months, a year ago, mainly because I didn't understand kind of how to monitor my footage overexposed and still dial in my lights to the correct values. Because I was like, if I'm looking at an overexposed image, how am I going to know like where to set my lights to? And the answer to that question is honestly pretty simple. Pretty much all you do is you just create a LUT that drops your footage by whatever value you want it to be dropped by, whether it's 1.5 stops, 2 stops, and then on the day when you're shooting, you load that in your monitor, and then you're able to see what your footage is going to look like when you drag it back down in post. This allows you to set your values, it sets your ratios, and make sure that you're lighting it the way you want to light it, but the camera itself is recording the footage still that 1.5, 2 stops overexposed. Real quick, if you're wondering, I'll show you how I kind of create one of these LUTs in Resolve. All right, so here in Resolve, we have our image here that we're going to make this LUT around. Again, I'm not a super technical person. I get what we're doing here is kind of technical, but I'm still not going to necessarily do this the right way. So I'm going to show you how I've created these LUTs before, and they work for me, but are they exactly 2 stops? Are they exactly 1.5 stop? No, but they get you in the range of where it works for me, so don't expect me to be doing a bunch of different, technical exposure chart matching, whatever. That's not what this is. This is a quick and dirty kind of 2-stop drop LUT that I use, and it works for me, and maybe it'll work for you. But getting into it, it is super simple to do. So we already have here our footage transformed from log to Rec 709. Bang. All that is, and you need to make sure that when you're doing this, you already have your kind of transform from log to Rec 709, because obviously the monitoring LUT that you want to use is going to be taking your footage from log to Rec 709. So for this one, I just did a simple color space transform from Sony S-Log3 to Rec 709. So that's the first step. Do that. If you don't know how to do that, I would suggest just looking up on YouTube how to use a color space transform to transform my S-Log3 to Rec 709. Super easy. So the real thing we're doing here that's going to actually create the LUT is in our node that's right before this, and this is going to be where we're dropping our footage by 2 stops. So you're going to want to go to the HDR wheels, or the high dynamic range wheels, which are right next to your normal primary wheels. Then you're going to come in and you're going to want to map your camera to the wheels here. So we shot in Sony S Gamut 3 Cine, and then our gamma was S-Log 3. So now that we have that mapped and it knows kind of, I guess, the values of the camera that we're using, we're going to come down to the global here, and then our exposure setting here, we are just going to drag this down to wherever we want our LUT to be. So I want this to be 2 stops lower than where I shot it, because I know I shot it 2 stops over. And so now we have a 2-stop drop. Super cool, keeps the values where they're, I think, supposed to be. It looks nice in my opinion, and it works for what I need. So that's what I do there. And then to export it as a LUT, you just right-click on this little thingy down here, and then we go to Generate LUT, and then you want to generate a 33-point cube LUT, and then just come in and name it whatever you want. 2-stop drop. And then hit save, and that will send it out to your desktop or wherever you saved it, and then you just take your memory card that you would have in your monitor, pop it in your computer, drag that on there, and yeah, then you'll pop it in your monitor and you'll have your LUT, and then you'll be able to make your shots that are 2 stops over in your camera monitor look like they are where they should be, which is 2 stops below that. So super simple. All right, so now getting into the specific FX3 Sony stuff here. If you have an FX3, you don't need to do the whole making a LUT to drop the footage in your monitor. You don't need to do any of that. You have that already built into your camera, and it's called Cine EI. Basically, if you don't know what Cine EI is, it is a setting in your camera that basically allows you to have your 2 base ISOs, and that's it. And then no matter what you change your ISO to, it is going to record your ISO at either that base 800 or that base 12,800. And then basically what those ISOs are doing and what they're showing you is what your footage is going to look like if you drop it or push it a stop, 2 stops, whatever the amount is that you want it to be. So for example, if my camera is rated at 800 ISO and I drop it to 400 ISO, basically that's not changing anything that's being recorded, but it's showing me what it will look like when I drop my footage by a stop in post. And so that allows you to have that 1-stop, 2-stop drop LUT without having to create one. And so this is what I do now all the time with my Sony camera. I don't mess around with any of the kind of creating my own LUTs to drop my exposure. I just use Cine AI because it's built in, it's more precise, and it is super easy to use. So again, it's literally all you have to do is if you're going to want to use 12,800, set a 12,800, and then just drop the ISO to kind of whatever the amount stopwise that you want to have your footage drop to in post. And then you're just going to monitor based on that, and you can use whatever LUT that you want to use because you're doing the dropping in your Cine EI settings and not actually in the LUT itself. So super useful. Wow, I think this is probably the most techie I have ever been on this channel. Sorry if I butchered any of that because, like I said, I'm not a techie person, but this is something that I just use very often and I think is a super cool setting. So hopefully you were able to kind of understand what I was saying here, and it made some sort of sense because this will dramatically improve your ability to light things where the scene may be taking place in a darker environment, or if it's like outside at sunset, this is also super helpful. And so any of those like super high contrast where you have a lot of shadow environments, being able to kind of overexpose like this and then pull it down and get those really, really clean, deep shadows is gonna benefit you a lot. So whether that be you use a whatever amount of stop you want to drop LUT, or if you have an FX3 and can use Cine AI, either one of those will work perfectly and help you get this job done. So hopefully you got something from this video and it was helpful, and if not, as always, my apologies, and I'll see you next week. Bye.